Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Hello, everybody. It's The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook with you again for episode 29 here. And glad you could join us and listen in on what I think is going to be a very provocative subject today that I'm going to try to tackle and unpack for everybody. And I'll get into that in a few moments. What I wanted to do first, just as I always do, update you location-wise. I am currently in Los Angeles, and any day in Los Angeles is a good day. I love this place. Over the years, my travels here have always been wonderful. It holds a special place in my heart. I went to college here, lived here, and have worked here for many years. There's something about LA. You know what I always say in describing the emotions I have for Los Angeles is that it's the light. There's something about the light in this place that just fills you with hope. And so enjoying a few days here working, did a collection yesterday. This wonderful collector in Orange County who I enjoyed spending the day with, selling all the antiques that I've been passionate about because he has gotten absolutely enchanted and wild collecting Labubu. And so I thought that was really interesting. So I got a whole tour of this incredible Labubu collection, many prototypes, one-of-a-kinds, sourced out of China and other areas, and learning about him. And he's even writing a book on the history of Pop Mart and Labubu and this movement in the market. I asked him if he'd come on a podcast later on, and he is going to. And we're going to have a back and forth about, I never thought I would do a podcast or a conversation about Labubu, but heck, I'm doing it. I think it's fun, and I think it will introduce doll collectors to another concept and idea within three-dimensional figurative art. That was a great meeting yesterday. A couple more meetings here over the next day, and then I'm off to my next spot for a table talk lecture, and that's this weekend, which is going to be in Wichita, Kansas. I always call the collectors in Wichita the Wichita Posse because they've got a strong collector culture there in Wichita, and they come to many of the auctions, and I always call them the Posse. So looking forward to seeing them again and having some fun in Wichita, and then back home for more travels and more table talks going through the month of October. So busy as always, traveling as always, and having a lot of doll fun with all of you out there in the world of figurative art. So this particular podcast title you've read, and I'm sure you're looking at it kind of puzzled. The more you pay, the more valuable it is. And so obviously this pertains to collectibles, not just everything, but it is one of my yogiisms out there that I have used at auctions over the years that everybody laughs because it is, of course, kind of ridiculous, but it's a yogiism, and it's supposed to be. I have spent my life loving yogiisms. And for those of you who don't know what that is, Yogi Berra, maybe some of you overseas that listen to this, was a famous baseball player who would always come up with these one-liners that were really ridiculous. And give you an example, one of them he always used was, "No one goes there nowadays. It's too crowded." And of course, the classic, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So I've always loved and used yogiisms over the years, and I came up with my own for the auctions, and that is, the more you pay, the more valuable it is. Now, ultimately, there is some truth to that. I mean, we could argue that it is a reality in the concept of collecting, but I wrote an article about it, and I've talked a little bit about it as well in my earlier podcast on how to value a doll, but I really want to break it down even deeper today and understanding all the elements of what goes into the decision-making where collectors go on a doll, specifically, especially at auctions, which are emotionally driven platforms, and why they work so well and why they are able to achieve valuations and values that may be beyond the norm of what you perceive is, because it taps into the idea of people having emotional connections with it and going further than the easy perception of a value of a particular item. So what led to this in my wanting to do this podcast? Because I really hadn't planned this, but yet again, and I've talked about it before, we had an auction this past weekend of the Dorothy McGonigal collection. And within that auction, there was incredible emotional bidding for a number of the pieces. And so very, very competitive. The auction took 8 hours to do 300 lots, which is about 2 hours beyond the norm. And a lot of this was not that I was up there, making jokes. Well, I was, but a lot of it was specifically related to the number of bids, sheer number of bids coming in. It just went on and on. I mean, I had particular lots that were taking up to 7 minutes to sell because the bids just kept coming and coming and coming on that particular item. So it took a while to get through. And it was a great day. People had a lot of fun, but it was really interesting. A day or two after the sale on social media, on Facebook, this collector, very, very nice collector out of Ohio, made a post on there trying to understand the pricing of one particular piece that went in the auction and why it went for the price it did. It was a Steiner that was estimated around $3,000 to $4,000, and it ended up selling, I think, for $41,000, somewhere in that range. So it was a legitimate and really, I thought, important question to ask, especially for new collectors who are maybe just kind of tapping into understanding pricing and what value is on a doll. And I think as well, good for those who might be steeped in the old culture of price guides that we'll talk about later on to better understand a current modern contemporary market that is very, very different than what I like to call your grandmother's doll collecting world. So we're going to tackle this today. And I thought rather than try to explain it in a comment in her post, which there were a lot of comments and a lot of opinions in that particular post on Facebook, I thought I would tackle it more in an in-depth look here on the podcast today on The Curious Collector to help people understand why do some things bring so much more than what may be a perceived value. So let me clarify one thing. The post on Facebook posed a great question. It was a wonderful question, and I think is an opportunity for collectors to have these conversations that are really important, especially for newer collectors who are just getting their feet wet into the market, to have an ability for clarification in understanding what drives pricing for a particular item. Because ultimately it is the thing that you face every time as you come up to an auction or even go to a show is, what is that item worth? And so the post, I thought, was absolutely wonderful and a great conversation to have. The comments mostly were very respectful, typically by collectors who've been in this for a while, and they kind of understand the nuances of how pricing works in today's market versus the old days. But you had some other comments in there which I'm going to address that I think people are missing the nuances of this. They're missing the emotions of this and what drives it. And they don't quite understand, or maybe they are steeped still back in the old days of price guide mentality. And so we're going to address that so people can have a better understanding, and also why it's so important for us to lift up each other in collecting and be supportive to each other. And we'll talk about that at the finish of this and how it relates to some of the comments that were made on there and how I think it's important to take a moment of reflection. And hopefully this will help you understand it more. So it will help you better be able to interact in the conversations of the whys of value. So let's understand markets, first of all. Markets in the big picture, not just the doll market or anything specifically, but the understanding that there are many different types of markets clearly out there. You have the stock market. You have the real estate market. You have the doll market. You have the used car market. And then you have a collector car market, and it just goes on and on and on. It's endless. So all of these markets come with their own level of investors or collectors or buyers or dabblers, whatever level they're at, but they're all very different. It's clear the doll market is not the stock market. The doll market is not even really the real estate market, but there are some comparables, and we'll talk about that. The doll market is specific in itself, like every collectible market, and I would argue that this may be the most emotional of any collectible market in the sense that these are three-dimensional figurative art pieces that represent our experience as human beings. So there's a direct connection, and then as well from the doll perspective, a link to childhood, which is for many, the most emotional and direct concept of nostalgia that you could ever find. So understand, and I say this time and time again, you have stock markets and then you have the doll market. The doll market is an emotional market. I don't see the stock market in a classic sense of being emotional. Nobody hugs their stock certificates. But you do hug your dolls. And so, we have to break that down and understand that emotions are what drive the market in any real collectible, and absolutely when it comes to dolls. So you will see a lot of people who will say, well, that was terrible, that doll brought, they'll never get their money back on it. Well, so what? I mean, this is not an investment financially. And I have said this time and time again over the years in my lectures across the world in talking with collectors, is that if you are collecting dolls for an investment, you're doing it wrong. And I'm saying a financial investment. You're doing it wrong. You are collecting these, or you're not really understanding what it is and why you are collecting these. You're doing it because it's an emotional investment. You're doing it for yourself. And it brings you joy. It brings you pleasure. And so if you think about it in that regard, it doesn't matter what you pay for an object in comparison to what you might later sell for it, because that doll is giving you something in return every day that you own it, every day that you look at it. All of the dopamine that you get released as you look at this doll, as first you got it, and that wonderful, joyful feeling in succeeding and getting a doll of your dreams. And then the years and years that it just keeps looking at you and making you smile, making you happy. This is the investment. I mean, really, if you're going to compare it to something and you're going to think about, you can't believe how much people will spend on something. Well, let's talk about a luxury cruise on one of these big new luxury cruise lines where you could spend $40,000, $50,000 on a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. And I'm not saying that's not worthwhile. For some, it is. If you've got the money and it's important to you, I think that's fantastic. Do it. It's going to give you a return of joy that is worthwhile if you have the financial ability to do it. However, the reality being, nobody ever says, well, that's crazy for you to spend that kind of money because you're never going to get any money back on it. Well, of course not. It's a trip. It's travel. You don't get to sell your Instagram photos out there. Well, some people believe they can, but I don't think influencers and Instagrammers are really making a whole lot of money in their setups of travel. But regardless of that, I'm wandering here, so let me get back on page. The reality is you get no money back, but that's okay. You accept that. Well, in the case of a doll, you may pay a lot more than you imagined you had to, and you went to a price that was far higher than what might be perceived in the market or comparables for particular models are out there. But that's okay. And years from now, you may sell that doll, and maybe it won't resonate in the moment in the market with other collectors at that time, and it might bring less. But that doesn't matter. That doll has given you for years an emotional investment, an emotional return that is incalculable. And so I tend to think that collectors need to look at dolls from that perspective more. Now, it's not always the case, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But for a lot of categories of pieces and for particular dolls, and we'll break down the whys of some dolls go so far beyond what comparable models might be perceived at. But ultimately, I go to the old premise, you do you, and forget about the chatter. So let's talk about doll markets and pricing, and let's talk about the history of them over the years, because there has been clearly an evolution. There's clearly been changes, and with each generation, you find different approaches to the understanding of the market and what people will pay for things. And you gain knowledge as well as to how common things are or how rare they might be as we evolve into this world of doll collecting over these multiple generations. I mean, in the early pioneer days, the market was scattered and basically no understanding as to valuations. And there was very little understanding as to what was rare and what was not. and people liked different things back then. So it's kind of hard to place really any sort of concrete explanation of that 1930s to 1960s doll market, which was vastly different than anything that's out there today. But then in the 60s and 70s, and this is where it becomes really important because some of you have collected within this age and remember it and might even still be steeped into that old school thinking, and that was the price guide mentality. This is when price guides started coming out onto the market, calling themselves the Bible of doll collecting, and really, I think, determining for collectors what a doll was worth, rather than collectors actually taking into account for themselves that particular doll and what it meant to them. So I've talked about this before. I remember doing auctions in the 90s, and you would look down and it would be a sea of blue, and everybody has a blue book, and you'd come up with a doll, it'd be Techumo, 14 inches, and everybody would quickly be turning the pages right to that model and looking at it, and it would tell them it'd be worth $2,800 to $3,600, let's say. And it put it into a box of valuation. It wasn't looking at that particular doll and taking into account what I have talked about in previous podcasts, and that's the 7 steps of valuing a piece for yourself. It wasn't taking any of that into account, and it could not see the doll that you were looking at. So ultimately, people tended to, not always, but they tended to, at that time, in that period of the marketplace, they tended to determine a value of a doll based on what the book told them it was worth. And they would follow that. I mean, I can remember the few collectors who would go more than the blue book at an auction for a particular model. And my gosh, the chatter at the sale, people coming up and saying, what were you thinking? Why would you go that high on that? Don't you see the blue book? Don't you read it? Don't you understand that the high value was $3,600 on this and you paid $4,500? And then if they got it below the blue book value, they would just go up and say, wow, you stole that doll. Nobody really talking about the why of it went so low or the why of it went higher than the perceived value, but just that it fell outside that boxed category. And that really ruled the day for quite a while. And it didn't take into account and understand as well how common many of these dolls actually were in the marketplace until a huge occurrence came, and that was eBay. And eBay really revolutionized a perspective of knowing that there were a lot of dolls that were a lot more common than anyone ever thought. And as such, the prices began to move downwards on those. And then we realized as well in the same light that there are a lot of dolls that just don't come up that often. And they started rising in price. And so you began to see this split and change. And with that came a new dynamic, a new generation of collectors that began to look at collecting not from the eyes of a book value, of a valuation, but rather from the eyes of their own emotional connection to that piece and determining for themselves what they are comfortable paying for that particular item, understanding a number of different factors. Will I ever see one like it again? Does it have a particular story or romance that resonates with me and my collecting that I can utilize this piece to tell others this story? All of these things add value. So it could be just who owned that doll before. I mean, I remember this when we sold Mildred Seeley's collection or Rosalie Wiles' collection, or even this weekend, Dorothy McGonigal's collection, which we'll talk about specifically. So all of these factors started having far more impact with a new generation of collectors who kind of threw away their books. And you began to see any kind of valuations, book values vanish by like 2006, 2007. And then people went full on in with making their determinations. Now, do they use comparables? Do they certainly look at pricing trends for particular categories? Of course people do. I don't want you to think that it's just willy-nilly out there and there's no understanding of certain guidelines that rule pricing and perception of markets. It's there, but then there are elements and things that can break a particular piece out of that mold and put it into a new light. And this is where a lot of people begin to wonder. And I use examples of like today, you know, back in the day of the price guides, Jameau Triste is a really great example of a particular model that has such a wide variation today. But back in the price guide days, a Jameau Triste would pretty consistently bring within a box value what was in the book that they were worth. And I don't remember what they were in the 90s, but I think you might have found that Gemotrice might have said something along the lines of 10,000 to 16,000, depending on size, costume, whatever. Well, as the books went away, you began to see a change in the marketplace of Gemotrice, and people began to assess them more on an individual basis. And that is putting in the 7 factors, which I invite you to, again, to go back to the original podcast I did on this subject and how to value a doll, the 7 factors, and determining what that doll has specifically for them, that particular collector, in presence, in costume, in provenance, and all these different factors, and then making a determination of what they're comfortable at. And this is why Gemotrice today, many of you say, well, I see Gemotrice bring $9,000, and then I see some bring $32,000. And I don't understand. And for a new collector, I get it. This can be very confusing. And for old school collectors who might be steeped in the price guide idea of valuations, it as well can be misleading to you in not really recognizing the changes in the marketplace that have occurred over these years with a lot of new generation collectors. So ultimately, yes, it is worth whatever it's worth. A particular model that resonates with 4 or 5 people, has that face, that costume, that provenance, was owned by that collector. It could soar. It could bring 40,000. It could bring 50,000. What is it worth? It's worth whatever it is to that person. And there can be no stopping sometimes the limitations on these particular items, and they will go far beyond what anyone understood. But to say then that that person was silly or why would they ever pay that is completely misguided, because to them it was very serious and very real, and they really wanted that. You know, Tammy Trujillo is a producer here at The Curious Collector, and she's right now sitting in her booth in another part of Los Angeles mixing all of this. And Tammy is unique as a producer for me because she's also a doll collector that I've known for a lot of years. And many of you know Tammy because of her writing on compositions, especially F&B historical series. And she just did a presentation in Norfolk at the UFDC convention on the F&B historic dolls, and I heard it was really well received. So I'm going to put Tammy on the spot. She hates when I do this, but I'm going to bring her on and have a little chat with her about her particular category and how she would feel and how she would bid or pay or buy and the price she would pay for something that she has been searching for. Now, Tammy, I know that there is a particular category of dolls that you are really hot for, and there are a couple that are on your holy grail list, aren't there?
Indeed. Any of the 21-inch display series F&B historical dolls, absolutely. Absolutely.
And if one came up at auction, and some of these I think you've been waiting 20 years to find.
Oh, at least, maybe more, probably more.
Right. So if one came up to auction, now you might perceive the value of an F&B historical series. What's an average price that you see them go for typically?
About $5,000 to $6,000.
Okay. But if there's one that no one has seen in a generation, that it came up to auction, how much would you pay for it?
As much as I needed to, as much as I possibly could.
And you probably would eat Jell-O for 2 weeks if you had to go a little extra.
Let me tell you this, Stuart. There was an auction years ago. Okay, this is probably 25 years ago, and it was up in San Francisco, as I recall. And my mom and I drove up there when my mom was alive. She was collecting with me. It was a Theriault auction, and there was a historical. And I had a paid-off car at that time. And I had actually taken a loan on that car. I used it as collateral to get a loan because I was coming to that auction and I was coming home with that historical. And it was fierce. I don't think I've paid more for historical since or ever, but we got done bidding and I was shaking so badly that I told my mom, I got to get out of here. And we walked out of the auction and took kind of a roundabout the hotel, and then came back in and watched the rest of the auction because I was broke by that point. I was so excited. The shaking was excitement at getting this doll and then a little bit of trepidation about what I'd paid, but it was more excitement. It was not like, oh gosh, what have I done? But I've already done that route of whatever you have to do because these dolls don't come up very often.
And I think you just absolutely summarized from a collector perspective what goes into the thought process on particular items for yourself. I know that there are some pieces that you like And we're going to talk about this in a minute, some pieces that you would enjoy having.
Right.
But you will have a far lower ceiling on those than you will that doll that you searched decades for.
Absolutely.
And you will go all the way. So, Tammy, as a collector, let me pose this question to you. Do you think about when you're going on it, how much you'll be able to sell it for later on?
No, I don't care. I don't care.
Exactly. And Tammy, I think, beautifully portrays the new generation of collectors that they don't care. They're going to get something back for it. Tammy, thanks for coming on. And I'm putting you on the spot again on this, but I wanted to get a collector perspective, and you're perfect. And you just so happen to be sitting right there in the booth. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I'm going to move on from here. Tammy summarizes exactly this idea of you have a Holy Grail doll, and collectors might have one or they might have 100 Holy Grail dolls. And your ceiling is going to rise exponentially on those particular pieces. And you're not going to care necessarily about selling it later on. As a matter of fact, the last thing you even imagine is selling that doll. It's a life doll. It's going to be with you forever to the end. And so with that comes more of clarity in the ability to compete for it to a level that you can afford. And it may be far beyond any price anyone's ever seen for a particular category of that doll, because that is the one you've been searching for. That is the one you have dreamed of for years. And you don't care what you're going to sell it for later, and you shouldn't, because that doll is going to bring you that shaking that Tammy described, that emotion, that feeling, that joy. That right there begins the process of returning to you on your investment far more than anything can from a monetary perspective. So let's kind of understand, though, that there are ultimately categories of dolls which you're going to far more see this type of market surge on than you will on others. There are multiple different categories of dolls. We ultimately have, I like to call them bread and butter dolls. And these are your everyday models that you're going to find out in the marketplace. And we can take a Simon & Halbig 1079 as an example, classic German child doll. Now, can you see disparities in the value of a Simon & Halbig 1079? You absolutely can. You can see it bring one day $50, and then the next day you can see one bring $1,400. And, why is that? What about that doll ultimately creates such a difference in value? And we've talked about this before in other podcasts, and it is those 7 things. It could be costume, it could be provenance. But where you're not going to necessarily see in a Simon & Halbig 1079 as one example, is it going for 10 or 20,000. I think the limitation, the ceiling drops no matter how nice it is, how powerful that doll is going to connect with someone, because you can't get over as an established collector knowing that, look, there's a lot of Simon & Halbig 1079s. So it's got a great costume, and I'm definitely going to push the envelope a bit over what might be an average value of $200 or $300, and maybe I'm going to go to $1,000. But there's very few collectors that are going to comfortably go up to $10,000 or $20,000 on that, as an example. Not always, but usually. So that is different than what we're talking about. Then you get into a category of what I would call interesting, offbeat, unique object. We'll take Dorothy McGonagall's auction as a perfect example, because there were a lot of different things that we can study in that sale. And if you have time, go back to Theriault.com, go to the archived auctions, and look at the day one, the Saturday auction of Dorothy McGonagall's dolls, and look at the prices and go through. It's a great learning exercise to kind of understand all the different nuances of the market. So if you go through there, you'll find this one lot. I think there were 6 early Grodner tall dolls that were all in original occupational costumes. They were wonderful. They were so charming. They were the tiniest things you've ever seen. I think they were 2 inches, 3 inches, but all totally original, and a wonderful theme behind them in these occupational outfits. They were estimated, I think, $1,000 to $1,200, and they ended up selling for $6,200. Again, you had a number of collectors emotionally bidding on these, loved these particular pieces because of the theme of them, the costumes, the charming nature of their little sizes, and they went for it. Interesting items like that can have a much higher ceiling of bidding, and they can be 10, 20, 30 times over what an estimate you see at in an auction is for them, because I would venture to say that you will never see another little group of 6 Grodner tall dolls like that. How much should you pay for them then? Whatever it takes within your budget to get them, because they are unique and you will probably never see them again. So that's the second category. Then you have a third category. It could be an established doll, but it has a little more of a rarity level. And this Steiner, as a perfect example from Dorothy McGonagall's collection that we've been talking about, really fits into this category. It's a desirable doll. It was, I believe, a C. Steiner, and it was in a wonderful little tiny petite size. It was totally original costume, original wig, original hair comb. It just had presence. It was fabulous. Now, you typically will see a C. Steiner in this size bring a few $1,000s, $3,000, $4,000, maybe $5,000, somewhere in that range. However, this one went for, I believe, $41,000. So what about that doll was different? Well, a lot of things. First of all, we talked about name. The collector's name, Dorothy McGonagall, one of the most beloved people in the world of dolls for an entire generation from the 70s through the 2000s. And she did a number of books, including the book on Jules Nichols Steiner that for many years was the go-to reference of the history of Steiner and her particular respect and love of his out-of-the-box thinking on a lot of the models and the dolls that he produced at that time. And so this particular doll was heavily featured in that book as being one of Dorothy's favorites. Now, it just so happened that a number of collectors were of the generation that they grew up with that book. And within that had become really emotionally connected. The person who got it was very specific. I talked to them afterwards. Stuart, I spent 35 years looking at that book and looking at that doll and dreaming of owning it one day, never really imagining or thinking it would come. So, of course, I'm going for it, because this is a probably once in a lifetime opportunity to enjoy a doll for myself that I have spent years looking at and desiring in that book and never finding one quite like it. And I want to point out something else. There's a lot of people, and you see it in social media in these comments, that say, oh, it was just two people who went crazy. No, that is rarely ever the case. Now, it can be, but in a lot of situations like this particular doll, you will find that there were many people bidding on it. And there were many people up into the 20s and low 30s bidding on it. I would say we had 5 to 6 people very active up into the 32, 33, 34,000 range on that doll. They maybe didn't register, but they were trying to get bids in. They were on the phones. We had multiple phone bidders. We had bidding online. So you had, I would say, 5, 6, 7 people all up into the 30s. And then only in the last few bids did you find that it was 2 people. So it is rarely ever just 2. When you get to a doll of this category that has emotional connection to a generation of collectors for various reasons, in this case, the name of the person who owned it, the fact that it was heavily featured in the book by Dorothy McGonagall, and the fact that it was absolutely original and wonderful with most beautiful expression and face, and it was so cute and in that wheelhouse size that everybody is crazy for right now, the little tiny ones, and the respect for Steiners that has been developing over the past few years, you are seeing a perfect moment that you pay what it takes to get it. There is never too much. Millie Seeley used to say, and she always gave sage advice in this, that when a collector would ask her, how much should I pay for a particular doll? And she would say, well, if that doll sings to you, if that doll makes your heart go crazy and beat fast, you pay whatever it takes within your budget to get it and forget what anybody else tells you. So those are the kind of 3 categories we've talked about. That you've got the bread and butter, you've got the really interesting, different, unique objects, which are at times esoteric and really don't have established values per se. And the sky's the limit on those items because you'll probably never find another like one again. Which leads us now to the third category we just talked about, and that is dolls of rarity, dolls of desire, dolls that are very popular in the market, and French bébés, really good fashions. We talked about Gemot Triste. You can find no limitations on a particular example that absolutely will soar from an emotional perspective by collectors, and they feel that it may be the only one like it they will ever see, with that presence, with that costume, with that background, with that provenance. In this case, the joy that collectors had looking at it over the years in Dorothy's books had impact. It had meaning. And this is absolutely what creates markets today. So I know that a lot of people then ask, well, Stuart, I don't quite get it. Why do you have estimates in your catalog on these pieces? Well, you kind of have to have a guideline, a framework from which to start with, especially if you're dealing with new collectors who want to understand better comparable pricing. And so you ask, well, why is the estimate so low? Why didn't you take into account all of these factors that you talked about? Well, we do take into account a number of different things, but we're not going to predict, or I'm not going to force on you the idea of an estimate being related to your emotions. That's for you to determine. So we give you a baseline, we give you an idea, and then your emotions take it from there. That estimate is not meant to be a box. That estimate is not meant to guide you to a ceiling. That is just a starting point, an idea of where some models like it or similar things before have sold for, and then you can take and decide from there how much that means to you and how far beyond you wish to go. So it's funny, we were talking earlier about different markets, and I talked about, stock market, and we talked about real estate market, and this is kind of interesting. And no, the real estate market is not a collectible market, although I think there's some people that do like to collect houses, but and that's a different matter. But the normal standard real estate market is one that's different, but there is something I think in the relationship to estimates that we can talk about in comparison with collectibles. So you take a house, and typically when you want to sell your house, you have an appraiser come in, and they're going to look at a number of different factors: the condition of the house, the size of the house, the location of the house, and then they're going to use comparables to come up with what they see as a current market value, given similar like ones either in the neighborhood or nearby have sold for as of late, and that will determine your appraised value. Let's call it, in our case, the estimate. Okay, so from there, it's placed onto the market. Now, what we have seen over the years is that there can be actually a very similar emotional effect on some houses into the pricing that they go for. And you see this because you've all heard in the U.S. market for homes, the bidding wars that ensue on a particular house. And they end up bringing 20, 30% over and above what the asking price actually was for that house. Now, what drives that? You could have two people who have driven by that house for 20 years, and they have loved that house. They always said, that would be my dream home. I would love to spend my years in that house. It has everything: the view, the color, the size, the yard, all of it is just perfection. It's my dream home. So you're going into this with emotions. You have absolutely been impacted by the past, just like that collector who looked at that Steiner in Dorothy's book for 35 years and dreamed of having that doll, just like the 5 or 6 other people who were bidding on it right there with her probably did as well. So in that case, in the real estate comparison, you will see a certain house will end up going far more than the asking price, all driven by the emotional connection that a few people happen to have with that home over the years and seeing it and absolutely dreaming of owning and want to make sure they have the best possible potential of getting that home. So there is something that maybe you can compare it to in real estate markets that I hope helps you understand a little bit beyond just the doll perspective. It's also important to bring this up as well in that really, and I've been warning people about this for 25 years in my lecture circuits and in my writings over time regarding the doll market, and really kind of understanding that it's been, of all the collectibles markets, probably one of the most approachable out there. And there are many factors that relate to this in the whys, but I look at comic books at $7 million, baseball cards, a world record at $11 million, stamps 5, coins 7.5 million. You look at all of these prices and you can't help but wonder what it is about dolls that has not brought us into that same echelon, because this is 3-dimensional. They are all 1-dimensional. a lot of it is men dominate those other markets. And I have been warning collectors for a lot of years that there are going to be changes in the marketplace coming as more empowered women financially come into collecting, as more couples come into collecting. And we're seeing that a lot now, where you're seeing husbands actually really involved in the doll collecting because they don't resent it like they used to. And that was back in the great accumulator age when collectors bought $3,000 and the husband didn't even have a chair to sit in the house. So, or maybe one. There was a bit of resentment in that respect, but collectors are far more pragmatic now, building tight collections of high quality. And husbands are seeing that, respecting it, respecting the artistry, respecting as well the stories behind the doll. And as well, they're far more exposed to the realities of the market. You know, they didn't always come to the auctions back then or go to the doll shows, but now they can see it online. They can watch the bidding and watch the interaction of collectors, and they have more respect for it as being real. And in that regard, they're far more connected and involved sometimes with their partner. And I'd say husbands, but it can be both ways, and far more connected with their partner in wanting to maybe not necessarily collect with them in the same sense, but they want to at least validate them, encourage them, and they feel a sense of pride of their partner, of what they are building. And so I'm going to take this Steiner as a perfect example. I talked to this collector afterwards, and she was getting nervous in the 30s and was thinking about dropping out at that point. But who was sitting there with her? Her husband. And she said, you know, I said to him, I'm getting really nervous. I don't know if I want to go this high. And he said, you have looked for that doll for 35 years and you have dreamed of that doll your whole life in collecting. Just go for it. And then she did. She said, I felt so much better when he said that. It really validated for me the idea of going further on. So this is really great. And this is also driving more of what we're seeing the pricing. And then I have said it before too, the idea, and this is exactly why, and we'll talk about it with social media, why a lot of collectors have gone underground with their bidding. They like it. And this is why more people are migrating to bidding online, and why the crowds at auctions are tiny, but the crowds online are massive. I tell this story and I'll tell it again. A year ago, going into a collector's home who had been coming to our auctions, a fixture at them for years. Loved being up there, sat right in the first row, bid with frenzy all throughout a day. And then during COVID, never came back again. And even after COVID, didn't want to come back and be at the auction. She instead discovered the joy of bidding online. As she said, what she found out was not just the comfort, not just the idea of being in your home, but she said, you know what? I realized the joy of everybody minding their own business. It's real. People want to collect their way. They want to collect for them. They don't want to collect how you perceive and want them to collect. They have their own agenda. And if they can do it in private, they don't have to hear the chatter. Ultimately, I think this is why you're seeing it. If you're asking yourself, why do our collectors more insular? Why are clubs smaller? Why are auctions not having the crowds they used to in person, but definitely online? It is because of this. People are tired of the chatter. They're tired of being told how they should collect, what they should pay, what they should buy, and what example. It's personal to them. And so we need to be supportive in that regard. And I'm going to finish in a little bit talking about that and how we can be more supportive. But first, I want to have a little bit of empathy for another idea and another perspective, and that is the perspective of the underbidders or the other people who were looking at this doll and really wanted it and their emotions and feelings. And I believe in empathy, and I think that collectors deserve empathy in this regard. And I understand the collector's heart. So I know that for many people, while this one person who got it is overjoyed and glad that she pushed to the end to get the doll of her dreams that she had spent 35 years looking for, I also recognize and know that there are the underbidders who wanted that. Now, maybe some only wanted to pay $5,000 or $6,000. Maybe some went up into the 20s. And then there were, as I told you, many that went into the 30s that didn't get that doll. And all of you are equally disappointed. I understand that. But ultimately, I want to start by saying this. And you have heard me, if you've heard me in my lectures before, tell collectors, and they look horrified in the beginning when I say these words, but they get it in the end, that I wish for every collector that there's always that one doll that you never find your entire collecting life, that you dream of and that you never can get. And why would I say something that sounds so cruel? Because ultimately that leads you into a life of passion and joy in collecting. If you got it all, it wouldn't be the same. So I think you can take a step back and realize, hey, it's okay. This is what keeps me going. And I say, turn it into a positive. All you have to do is keep outliving everybody else. And eventually it will come around. You'll find it. I talked about Estelle Johnston years ago, the great collector, finally getting this one doll that she had been on 5 or 6 times. It had come up over like a 40-year period at various auctions. And she could never get it. It always went higher than she was comfortable paying at that time. And she just said, I'm just doomed. I'll never get this doll. Finally, it came up like the 6th time, just 2 years before she passed away. And she bought it, she got it, and she got it at a price she was comfortable with at that moment. And she came up to me and she said, Stuart, I just found out the secret to getting everything I want in collecting. I just got to keep outliving everybody else. So there is that. And so not only does it keep collecting interesting, but it keeps you in the game. If you had it all, it wouldn't be fun. So I say, take losses, take losing, take it with a positiveness that it's okay. You learned from it. You had the experience. You can brag that I bid on that doll and I fought for it, and you can wait for another one. The other thing that I hear a lot of times people saying is they take a few examples. Now, this auction we had of Dorothy McGonigal's collection had a number of pieces that soared far beyond estimated values and had tremendous emotional bidding going on. There is no question about that. But you know, it's interesting. As an auction house, I years ago shifted away from heavily promoting or publicizing or doing ads related to record pricing. That is, big prices that were achieved, which has been an industry norm with auction houses around the world over the years. I actually wanted to stop doing that, because I don't think it necessarily encourages collecting, because you'll hear a lot of collectors say to themselves then, oh, I'm looking at those big prices and I guess I'm just priced out of the market. And that's a horrible thing. That, I am absolutely telling you, is my greatest fear for a lot of collectors in actually believing that, because they're seeing some of these record prices and they imagine that it's done for them. They'll never be able to afford a doll that they really want again out there. Well, that's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. So I would love to do an ad that featured all of what I thought were great buys of that particular auction. And I encourage you again to go back and look at this auction, examine everything, not just the big prices that everyone tends to get fixated on, but go and look all the way through and identify for yourself pieces that you will say inevitably, I was so glossy-eyed from the bigger prices, I totally missed this one going, and wow, it went reasonably. I can pick a number of fashions that day because it was so bebe-oriented and everybody was fixated and fighting on the bebes. I thought many of the fashions that day were more approachable and very, very approachable and good buys. Now, it may not be what you collect. Those dolls that I thought went for a reasonable price may not have been specifically for you as an individual, but it shows you that in every auction, you are going to have certain categories that are going to go reasonably, and you got to show up to see. You got to come into the game, because inevitably you're going to hit that one sale where something you really want is going to click, is going to work for you price-wise, and you're going to get it. What is the old saying? 80% of success is showing up. So just keep plugging it in, and it's fun. It's enjoyable, and you're not going to get it every time. But the more you show up, the more you come in, the more you examine, the more you study, the more you pay attention not just to the big prices, but to everything, the big picture, you will begin to see entry points, doorways open for you that others are going to miss, and you will find opportunity. And that's part of the joy of the hunt. And the hunt is everything in collecting. As Tammy says, and what keeps Tammy into this, if she gets all the F&B historical series dolls, every single one of them that's known, well, it's kind of over. And so Tammy's joy in collecting a lot of it, I mean, she'll enjoy looking at these dolls and owning them, but that joy of the hunt, that dreaming of that one, it's gone now. So I would hope she find a new category to fixate on. But in this particular case, it gives you an example of how this can keep you engaged and active and moving forward in collecting, and how it can actually be the fun part of collecting, the dreaming, the hunting, the waiting. So, how do we be better ourselves to the collectors that get these dolls that you dreamed of? Because as I said, I'm empathetic to those who were the underbidders, and we need to prop them up, encourage them. We need to be happy for them that they fought hard for something that they dreamed of. They clearly wanted that Steiner, as we use this one example. And with that, it was absolutely a dream doll that they spent 35 years looking for, and they got it. We should be happy for them. We should be joyful for them that they were able to achieve this. But social media is, how do I say this? Let me just say that with social media, I have always believed from a perspective of commenting and relating your opinion about something is it something you would walk up to that person and say to them directly? And that's how you should guide yourself. Now, for some people, they would probably say something bad in person too. But that's very few people. Social media seems to invite and give an opportunity for people to kind of go beyond a level of politeness. I would say be polite. You also don't understand and realize how this can discourage, if it was a new collector or somebody who's only been in this for a couple of years that got into the situation of emotionally bidding for that doll and got it, and then later on went and read some of the comments in social media regarding that, how awful they might feel. Florence taught me this years ago. She taught me this one premise when I first came back into the business in 1987 after college. She said, Stuart, this is the most important lesson I'm going to give you in how to interact with collectors. No doll collector out there wants to be thought of as a fool. Very simple. And that has guided me throughout the years and should be guiding you as collectors in remembering that too. You don't want to be made to be a fool, neither do they. And they're not. They bid with heart, they bid with passion, and they had the budget to get a doll of their dream. Let's support them. Let's lift them up. Our hobby has enough people calling it creepy, calling it strange, calling it whatever. We have the outsiders and the others pushing us down. We're trying to lift the messaging up. We're trying to be cognizant of how the others may perceive what we are doing and changing that narrative. Well, it starts at home. We've got to be able to lift each other up in this process as well. And so that's why with social media, in these moments, remember, this was one person's joy. This was one person's moment. Lift them up. Be kind to each other. We are all walking each other down the road.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.